Johan, can you introduce yourself to the group?
Sure, thanks so much. Cool intro. So my name is Johan Christensen. I am, as Aleksander said, the CEO of City Network. We've had kind of two phases of the company, so to speak, in the sense that we've been in business for almost 20 years. Over the last 12 years, we've been focusing on building out the cloud services on a global scale. And we do so in a simple way. I guess you can call it a competitive situation with the AWS and Azure, but we do it with a European flair, where we look at being best in breed, so to speak, when it comes to the complex situation that we got in Europe, when it comes to laws and regulations in general, and we also look at European values as a core. So our core focus is the European enterprise, making sure that we can grow with them on a global level, but make sure that we do that from a European angle. So with the situation that it is today, it certainly is a super interesting time to have these dialogues in and around the whole regulatory situation and what's going on in Europe and in the world as a whole.
Excellent. That's great. So let's talk a little bit about this. Why does it matter? Why do people want privacy respecting cloud services? And what does it actually mean that they respect privacy and European regulation?
That's a broad question, right? I mean, I think, to be honest with you, I think very few people actually understand, on the one side, the value that we have of data, right? We can look at Facebook and these guys that are doing very well with data and how they make a lot of money off of it. But on the other side, there is this dark side, right? Where you can actually be harmed in a big way. I usually say, like, if people that have lost their identity online, for example, they very quickly realize what the dark side of losing that identity is, so to speak, right? So on the one side, it's something that we're slowly but surely maturing into, and we've also seen that evolve, right? I would say over the last 5-6 years, it's really grown. There's been data loss for a long time. If you look at banks, healthcare, that kind of stuff. But frankly, it's first now that we all are starting to look at this more from a holistic view, as in, why do we even have this? So in the founding laws of the EU, for example, I think it's paragraph 8 or 7, where there's like the right to privacy. It is that fundamental that we have the right to privacy, equally to the other big European rights that we have, so to speak. And there's a reason for that. And I think the laws are coming into play, of course, to try to help companies guide literally what I see as respect for your customers, respect for that data that you're being allowed to actually process, so to speak. So it is important from many aspects. And I would say that in an ever more digital world where data, we throw around these worlds like, data is the new black type of thing, right? But we see what those people with the ownership of the data, what they can do. And clearly, I think we're all seeing that is becoming a competitive edge, right? The more data you have, the more knowledge you'll have. And from that information, you can make moves that the people without the data cannot make, right? The key, of course, is how do we manage all that data and still respect the individual in the middle, right? So it's a broad topic, no doubt.
Yeah. Okay, got it. I remember when I talked to you last week, actually, we talked a little bit about what we can actually talk about here. And I asked you about some stories, and you mentioned that you have actually something that an interesting success story, someone who moved to the kind of service that you provide. So maybe we could start with that, and some basically specific case. How does what you offer, what your company offers, is different from all these large cloud providers that that we are all familiar with?
Well, I mean, there's I think if you take a step back, right? Why is everybody interested in cloud services? Why is everybody interested in infrastructure as a service? The key aspect there is that we all need to automate, right? In an all digital world, digital comes into play no matter what you do today. If you make furniture, you need to have a digital world. If you have a SaaS service, you have an even more digital world, but digital is there all the time. And going back in the days, we've now changed to a situation where, before we could produce one, let's say, with 100 developers. Today, with automation, and change of the organization, we could produce 5 or 10. And when everything is going digital, that is becoming the incentive to actually compete in the market, right? You can deliver more features, different services, and in general, different models that allows you as a company to evolve much, much faster. And I think that's like a key aspect. You know, when it comes to us, we're delivering that infrastructure that allows you to fully automate. You might use Terraform, you might use Ansible, whatever it might be. But the key is, you know, of course, that we have that European angle. And, you know, because the regulatory side has become very complex. We started with bank and finance and healthcare, right? And government agencies. Those are the types of verticals, I would say, that always have had a little bit of a challenge, right? Like the bank secrecy law has been there for a long, long, long time. Basel 2.3. You know, these are things that have been in the EU for a long time. But with GDPR, of course, that now all of a sudden has broadened like crazy. Today, just about every country in the world have specific laws to their government. So when it comes to then being able to, one, innovate faster, meaning that you automate with your new infrastructure, you have your organizational changes and so forth that you need to do to make sure that you can move that forward in a very fast pace. At the same time, on the other hand, you have to respect the data. You have to make sure that you follow the laws and also values, right? Take climate, for example. You know, unfortunately, I think that maybe in IT, we don't ask that question often enough, meaning that, for example, you know, if somebody goes into Microsoft 365, who asks, you know, what kind of impact that has? So there's a lot of those aspects that we work heavily with. And the difference also, of course, being that we run just about everything on open source, and we engage heavily in open source, and we think we can become a better provider doing that. But really, it's the combination of solving the, you know, fast development track, and at the same time make sure that whether you're a bank or just a common company, making sure that you can actually adhere to the laws that we have here in Europe.
Got it. Yeah, I think that's a good point, you know, to bring this up, why people want infrastructure. You mentioned infrastructure as a service. You mentioned open source. So maybe let's focus a little bit on that. What's the benefit for the end user? Well, I shouldn't say end user, for the company buying cloud services, that the infrastructure that you operate is based on open source software. What's the benefit to your clients?
Listen, I think there's two philosophies, right? You know, on the one hand, you go into something like an Amazon, right? There's so much services around it. It's great in many ways. You can quickly get to where you want to get, so to speak, right? Because the services are there, and boom, you're up and running, usually faster. The downside of that track is, of course, that the further in you go with those services, the more locked in you're going to be. The other side of that philosophy is using more open source, right? Now, the drawback, you know, for a company that are coming to us, comparing to, let's say, AWS, is that they need a little bit more knowledge. They need to use a few extra tools that are available around. Instead of using, let's say, the automation tool that Amazon offers, then you use Terraform or Ansible or something like that. And in being able to do so, you now more or less guarantee that you can actually work with any provider. You have much less lock-in. You have a freedom to also run certain things even on-prem should that happen. And I think that in any case, no company should want to go with one provider and lock themselves in with one provider, right? Anything can happen where you would like to have the choice at some point go somewhere else. So there's a slew, of course, of benefits, but I think that's a big driver. And one should not be fooled. You know, the large providers, whether Chinese, American, or whatever, open source is in the bottom. The difference is that we try to keep open source vanilla. So let's say if you set up Kubernetes native or OpenStack native, it's the same thing as what we're running, meaning that you can actually do something similar, and therefore you don't have the same vulnerabilities. So that's definitely one aspect of it.
Got it. So I heard some interesting keywords there, like avoiding vendor lock-in and being able to change providers. So this is one of the most fascinating, actually, things I find about your company and about other companies that use open source. That in a sense, the benefit that you're offering is that you're telling your clients, you know, if you don't in the future don't want to work with us, we make it very easy for you to start using somebody else's services. And it's kind of paradoxical because you make it easier for people to stop using your services, but that's a benefit. That's something that you promise them that they don't lock you in. And I like that. I think this is very important to clients because that means that if they want to use your services because of the quality you provide, because the service you provide, et cetera, not necessarily because we are now locked in and we can't move away. I think this is great. By the way, there's something I wanted to comment. You mentioned the European laws. When I invited you, I mentioned that we have a lot of Americans in the audience, and you responded, this is not a problem because they also need to target European clients. So this is kind of interesting. Maybe you could elaborate on this. So this is also relevant to American companies, not just to European ones.
Yeah, I mean, without a doubt. I mean, I want to make sure everybody understands that I would love for the world to be super simple, and the internet is something where you just throw up your data and everything is secure and nothing bad ever happens. But as we've seen, that is not the case. Security is growing a concern of everybody. The regulatory aspects are coming along because there are issues with how we continue to evolve this world, right? So anybody operating in Europe needs to adhere to the laws. It's like saying, BMW, if they want to sell a car in the United States, of course, you're not going to have kilometers an hour on the velocity, to see the velocity, right? You have to adapt to that. And anybody else coming to Europe, which is, so far the largest market, single market we have on Earth, they also have to provide for those laws, right? So of course, we and other European companies and potentially foreign companies, in the sense of depending on where you come from, can provide according to those laws, depending what data you have, of course. But yeah, it's something that everybody needs as a whole.
Yeah, and this is actually one of the important things to grasp, and also something that to me was kind of an epiphany, that regardless where you're based, if you target customers in Europe, you need to follow European regulations. If you target customers in California, you need to follow California regulations with regards to data protection and privacy. And when you realize that, just like you said, the world has become very complex because of that, because all these different countries have different regulations. But it is also interesting that Europe has one of the most stringent regulations. So if you follow European ones, you're probably okay with other jurisdictions. All right, so I wanted to ask you again about this story. Maybe you could talk a little bit about a client that moved from the more sort of traditional big tech clouds into the sort of open source based world where they use a provider that uses vanilla open source technology, and what was the benefit, how they benefited from that?
So actually, there's two sides to this story, right? It's one of the best use cases I know of, at least myself, and I include a lot of companies in that. I won't mention names, but it's a bank that has managed to literally tenfold their digital output, and that's happened in about 5 years, 4 to 5 years. And of course, when somebody realizes that, well, before we had, let's say, I'm just taking hypothetical numbers, before we had 100 developers. Those 100 developers developed one. Now the same 100 developers can develop 10. That is an incredible, very seldom do you see that kind of jump in anything. Light bulbs, LED actually had that, but very seldom do you see any jump like that. And in this case, it was a company who was willing to invest in the knowledge in their employees, right? Because we talked about the two different philosophies. You go easy with some of the big players because it is easier, and you can get in quickly. But these guys wanted to invest for the long haul, right? So they wanted to go open source for a lot of reasons. They wanted to make sure that they actually educated their employees in and around it. And that education and that knowledge, of course, was something that took a little bit longer time, right? But the way they looked at it was to say this, well, us putting money back into our employees and having greater knowledge, in the long haul, that'll actually be the big guarantee that we're going to be the one who innovates faster than everybody else. If you go to a short, quick route, versus actually having some of that knowledge, take something like ML and AI, which these people are using a lot today, right? A lot of people are uploading something, they do a few checkboxes, but might not know exactly what's going on. And the more knowledge, in their case anyway, the more knowledge that they have, they felt like that was a guarantee for that innovation. So the success in this case is really what the digital transformation is all about for enterprises, right? which means that you have to innovate so much faster. And for that to happen, your digital stack needs to move daily. So they went from literally having about 40 updates a month to somewhere in the neighborhood of 600 updates a month. And it used to be when the updates came like every 6 months, right? Now they're actually doing live updates. And keep in mind, this is a bank, very sensitive data, very sensitive systems. They're doing it 24/7 all the time. Now, has there been problems? Of course, once or twice, it's been a big bang. But the way they see it is that since we're doing so many updates, usually it's a fairly small bit of code that we're updating. We see it fairly quickly, and it doesn't become this big thing. Before it used to be, when we update it, we could be down for a day because all of a sudden the systems didn't come up, right? So the benefits are just humongous in the sense, if you want to compete in this digital world that we live in, you have to modernize and go that route. And in this case, I think it's extra cool because, normally bank in Europe has so many more rules, so many more regulations that they also have to adhere to. And then to be able to do that journey way more fast than many else is quite an achievement.
Got it. Yeah, so the speed, exactly. So I would like to now invite the audience. It's 20 past, invite the audience to the discussion. I'm going to continue asking questions, but feel free to ask questions either in the chat or you can just unmute yourself and ask questions and join the discussion. There are some people I know in the room. Welcome, Tomasz and Marek. I know both of you have definitely very interesting things to say on this subject. So feel free to comment. I'd like to ask you a little bit more about the standards. So your company uses OpenStack Kubernetes. So when users, your companies that build infrastructure on top of your cloud, when they use your technology, they use open standards, if I'm not mistaken, right? So that means that is the code they write that is written against that an open API, and that makes it easy to later take that code and port it to either some other cloud provider or on-prem. And so this is something I wanted to ask you a little bit more about. So the integration between on-prem infrastructure and your cloud infrastructures. How do your clients do it? Especially, they have the advantage they can run OpenStack on-prem. You have OpenStack, so they can use the same code to run both. How do they manage that integration between on-prem and kind of the hybrid model of having both on-prem and the cloud?
I mean, you're completely right? So one of the key aspects that we do in anything that we bring as a function is that we try to keep the vanilla API, right? And in all honesty, I think that's open source challenge, right? The whole interoperability. You'd think that it'd be super easy to use, let's say, Open Telecom Cloud on us, right? Because we both use OpenStack. OVH uses OpenStack, right? But of course, there's many flavors. There's a lot of people doing different things with it. So from our point of view, we try to make sure we stay vanilla, meaning that we take the upstream and actually use that. We don't do anything downstream to mess with it any way, shape, or form, right? We can add to it other APIs, but we never change the actual API calls of, let's say, OpenStack, or for that matter, native Kubernetes or whatever tool it might be that you want to use. So that makes it, of course, a lot easier when you use something like a Terraform or whatever. If I want to shoot something to something that I'm running on-prem, if I want to shoot it to multiple provider, let's say an OVH or a city or somebody like that, you can also do that much easier. Now, there's, of course, complexity when you want to do certain things. You might want to run live between two things and so forth, right? So there's networking, there's a lot of other aspects, but one key aspect there is that you make sure that your credential aspect and your APIs are being kept the same, because it does make it a lot easier for you to push through. And that's not to say that it doesn't work to go with somebody completely different, right? But as everybody here on this call knows, that does create a whole different layer of complexity.
Got it. Yeah, so now I want to segue to a related subject, something that I did mention in the description of the event, which is that you're also involved in the GAIA-X project, the GAIA-X project for increasing digital sovereignty of Europe. It's a project initiated by the French and German governments And now a multitude of European countries are involved in it. And it's a framework of creating, let's say, independent cloud services. And I wanted to ask you, how does that GAIA-X project fit into what you're doing at City Network?
Well, I think, let's take GAIA-X first, right? So GAIA-X, it wasn't really created by the government, right? So it was Bosch and Siemens, two large, as you guys know, German companies. They put their heads together saying, and went to the German government saying, hey, listen, for us, it does not seem to make sense that all our data is going to end up in China or in the US. We believe that it's important, similar to having railways in the 1800s, that it's very important that IT infrastructure can also be delivered from Europe. And really, it all came down to choice, right? Meaning, like, there's got to be choice in this market. Otherwise, we're afraid that we're going to have to choose vendors that might not suit us for whatever reason. As you've seen, as soon as Whole Food was bought by Amazon, Walmart wanted to leave Amazon, right? There's so many reasons why you might or might not want to be with somebody like that, right? So GAIA-X was then kicked off, where a lot of things have happened since, but in that, in short, it's a framework to encourage providers such as us to deliver services that actually work for Europe. It should be a given that we can keep our laws like GDPR and a slew of laws that we have, right? But also European values. So those are the two main things. Create that framework to make sure that happens. The way that looks right now is that there's going to be a catalog of services. In that catalog, one should know then exactly what to expect from a service, so that and make it easier to say, here, GDPR is not a problem. Here, this is not a problem. Because a lot of people are having a hard time, seeing what's going on. And if one takes that just a little bit broader, right? If you look at this at, over just 15 years, 2006, you have an AWS kicks off, 2007, iPhone comes on. That's the start of the digital transformation, automation in general, right? It used to be virtual machines before, now it's all about automation. Then from 2012 on, we started to realize the value of data. We touched on this before, right? The value, like at Facebook, how they use it to make billions, and the dark side of it, right? If it gets into the wrong hands, it can be really, really bad. Today, let's say from 2020 and on, and I think actually Angela Merkel said it best. She said already back last year in Davos, she goes like, if Europe wants to live the way we lived since after the war, we need to learn how to make batteries to drive a car. We need to learn how to make a CPU to build a computer. We can't even build a computer. And above all, we need to learn how to do cloud computing, because the owner of the data is going to be the one who has the competitive edge. So I think from like last year and on, or 2020 and on, I think we've entered a different phase. Yes, the legal aspects are very important still to be able to do that. But now I think there's other things that play, like vulnerabilities, right? Like Microsoft went down 7 hours the other week, and the Swedish government was paralyzed. And then somebody realized, wow, maybe it's not great that we just have one provider. Maybe we need to think about resilience. And that goes far, right? And I think this chips crisis has also put like a top of mind, that we are in for some vulnerabilities here. And I think GAIA-X is a foundation for Europe, both to encourage, more innovation in the infrastructure layer, because today, most of Europe's innovation is above the infrastructure. We have great companies, Spotify, and, these that are coming up new, but they're apps, right? And in the governments of Europe, of course, know if Apple wanted to quench that, they could in a heartbeat, unless the government stepped in with regulations, right? Because Apple Music would very quickly dominate if you own the platform. So I think GAIA-X is partly that, where, getting that framework to make sure that Europe can adhere to, encourage, and also, of course, adhere to those laws and things that we do in Europe.
Got it. Now, that actually brings me to another issue, which is I've heard actually recently some criticism of, maybe not necessarily criticism, but an observation of GDPR, which is that many of these ideas behind, data protection are political in nature, that it is to become independent from American providers, for Europe to become independent. But the burden of that shift is put on businesses who are not necessarily prepared for this, because the infrastructure today is primarily in the US. That's where the big clouds are, right?
And China.
And in China as well, yes. So what would be your take on that? And what do you think about this argument? Do you think that it is indeed the case that it's a political problem put on businesses, or do you think that GDPR on itself, and I know you're a great supporter of GDPR, that it's well thought through and it's not an unnecessary burden for businesses?
Listen, laws can be a burden, right? I mean, sometimes I think it's a pain in the ass that I can't drive as fast as I want on the road, right? Because I'm in a hurry. But thank God there are laws saying that I actually have to stay within a certain boundary, because our whole democracy is built on laws. And the day we start disregarding the laws, well, then you have anarchy, right? So I think it's incredibly important to have that as a no first. I think that Europe was early to recognize that, shoot, data is really important for the future. And to be honest with you, I don't think we've seen anything yet. We don't understand it yet, right? What's my kid who's 2 years old or 3 years old? What's he or she going to grow up in? And how is that data going to be used for or against her, right? And I think that that's the kind of things that Europe has been seeing. We need to regulate this. You know, the first thing was obvious. We have in our founding laws, privacy, respect privacy. We do that for anything else. We take that for granted. But as soon as you go online, it becomes this pseudo whatever, and it's kind of surreal, where all of a sudden you even have government agencies that are thinking, those laws are not so important. I think that we're starting to see, like I said, now with the vulnerabilities that are being built up in the society, I think that in conjunction with just understanding that our 7-year-olds that are starting school, their data cannot be thrown out just like this. We have to actually protect that, because the bad things that are happening to the person that lost their ID online, right? Which is, trust me, not something anybody wants to, that can become even worse. And we just don't know what that is. I also think the confirmation of GDPR, you saw Brazil now adopted, other countries have adopted very similar type of language in trying to protect their, both young ones, but yours and my privacy as well, right? It is something that is critical for us going forward. It's actually very difficult to understand, like, what could actually happen. There's some people that explain this a lot better than I do, but there's so many bad things that could happen. So there's a reason why we have the law. And my recommendation is not to see it as a burden, see it as a competitive edge, right? You, Mr. Company or Mrs. Company, that building the next SaaS service, if you intrinsically work in these protectionisms or protection items that we can put in thanks to GDPR, because it's laid out there, so we can actually follow that. And when we do that by design, you now have a competitive edge, because frankly, I don't think it's going to be the agencies that are going to give you fines that you have to worry about. Europe is not good at giving fines. We give some fines to Google and them here and there, and then they do the same thing over again, right? But it's the people that you serve, so your customers. I think that your customers one day will be smart enough to say, I demand that you protect my data, because my data is very important. We're not there yet. Most of us, we log on to Facebook, we don't really care. I'll sign up here, I'll sign up there, and it's the wild, wild west. 10, 15 years from now, I don't think it will be. I think we've realized that this is something that I need to be careful about. And I think that, again, Europe is taking great steps, and California has had their laws. I think the rest of the world is following suit.
Got it. Yeah, so this is definitely very interesting. The customer pressure is what perhaps we'll see in the future, and I think it is increasing already. But perhaps it's not as strong as some of us who are more aware of the problem. Perhaps because we work in IT and we know how much can be done with this data. That we realize that. I have a question on two questions on the chat, so I'm going to start from the top. Magdi. Good to see you, Magdi, again, by the way. Apple has annoying privacy obsessions, which only make it harder for developers to work. Okay, so this is interesting. So the point here is that developers, for developers, it's harder to follow those privacy regulations. Magdi, by the way, if you also can, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you can comment, I know where you're located, how things look like when it comes to, in terms of privacy from your location, from your country, it would be great, because it would be very interesting perspective also that we don't have, the rest of people over here don't have. You have a very unique, I would say, perspective in this room on that matter because of the place you live. So if you could comment that from that perspective, would be great. Johan, what do you think about this? The privacy obsession just only make it harder for developers to work.
I mean, it comes back to the same thing, right? Yeah, it could be that we have to take an extra step to protect data. But let me give you if we now realize our data, my particular data is very, very, very both sensitive, but also valuable. Now, if I take a comparison there, the developer who works with your bank account, somehow my money in my bank account, there we're probably okay to say, yeah, have a few rules around that because I don't want to lose my money tomorrow. Have a few regulatory aspects around that because it's so important. I think, again, what we haven't realized is that value of that data. Even though Facebook is making billions and billions and billions with just our data as the currency, so to speak, we're still not quite there understanding both the value, but again, how sensitive that data is. So I think that as a developer, the quicker we get to the understanding, so to speak, of saying that, no, listen, these rules are here for a reason, you know, and I will use those rules to my advantage because Apple, when they came with these changes, you know, they did that for a reason. They're not doing that just for fun or messing with Google, who's now like, wow, we can't take the data any way we want to. And lots of apps that are all of a sudden in a whirlwind of trouble because they can't just steal your data the way they want to. They too have realized that, wow, even though we don't know exactly where it's going to lead us to, we need to put protection in place now. It might already be too late for some data, but I think that, yes, it can feel like a challenge, but try to turn that around and say, okay, they did that because it was the right thing to do. How do I make that the best for me? And how do I make that to an advantage for my company, whatever I do?
Got it. I like that, turning it into an advantage. I have another question from Christina. What do you think about the impacts of data leaks on privacy?
Okay, so I think there's two sides to this. I think the leak aspect is similar actually to the regulatory side, right? Most companies spend too little money. Most people think it's a pain in the butt that we also have to do security, because leaks to me is a security aspect, right? Now, security and regulatory goes like this. Some laws will actually make things more secure, but security, as you know, is a separate thing from that. So I think that just like with the laws, we're way behind the 8 ball when it comes to security. I think the investments have to be so much greater. We had a thing here in Sweden, by the way. One of our 4 largest grocery stores one day got ransomware. Actually, it was a subcontractor of them. They couldn't charge for anything. 850 stores throughout the country was shut down for a whole week because they had a security breach. And that goes to show how incredibly powerful these leaks are, right? If you then look at the leaks from a privacy perspective, I mean, again, it's incredibly bad, right? You even have big companies like Amazon and Twitch, you know, whom you think have the resources to be secure all over, right? They leak millions of people's data. It is equally bad, of course, when somebody has a leak versus just not following the regulatory. The result is the same. A leak, of course, is more somebody's trying to do evil, trying to get to the data, right? And the scary part about it, I would say, is this: it's more a matter of time when somebody has a leak or a hack or something, more so than that, okay, it's going to be a random thing. It seems everybody has it. So it has a detrimental effect on privacy because your data is probably out there. through some leak at some point. And that's also why the government, we need to make sure that we enforce these rules, right? We need to make sure that it hurts a little bit to do that, because you just leaked my data and that was very valuable. Had it been your money, it would have been easy, right? We lost your money, and then all of a sudden people get a value from that, right? We need to have the same type of approach when it comes to your privacy.
So you think there should be punitive fines associated with, so for example, over in the US, we just had a leak of, or it was a hack. One of our third largest data phone providers got hacked. Every single customer, their personal information was stolen. So do you think it's reasonable? Like, should we enact laws that say, okay, if that big of a breach happens against you, obviously your security is not good, so you should be fined. The company should be fined.
So first off, I think in the US, you guys are like light years ahead of Europe when it comes to fining, right? If you do $1 billion, we do $5 million in fines, right? So it doesn't really hurt over here. I think the US, for a long time, it's been in the billions, right? Where it does hurt. And Equifax, they're like, you know, there's a lot of these breaches, right? But a lot of them end up paying a lot of money as fines, right? And of course, if that fine hurts, that company most likely will change their attitude towards security, and it's one step in the right direction. But yeah, I do think you need to be fined. If you look at GDPR over here in Europe, you know, each item has a value, right? So the bigger the leak is, let's say we had 2 people and it's cost 10, you know, you have $100 for each person's leaked data. If you have 10 people, that's a certain fine. But if you have 3 million people's data leak, well, that's times $100, right? So, and that is the way it's supposed to be enacted. Now, GDPR has not gotten that far. We haven't seen those kind of fines of that kind of level, but there will be that type of fine, because frankly, even though, of course, when you get hacked, it's not something you want it to be. You might have even been good at security and you still got hacked, right? You know, we have those kind of issues, right? So I think that that's going to continue to move forward, regardless if you just being sloppy with the law or you actually being, you know, getting a breach because somebody hacked into your systems of some sort. I think it has to be, right? If it's so valuable, you would have never accepted it if it was your $1 million in your bank account and somebody took it. You'd be livid. My whole life savings, blah, 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 blah. And we would have never accepted that. But the banks have had these regulations for a long time. Bank secrecy is there for a reason. Basel 2.3 in Europe is there for a reason. So yeah, I think that we actually need to go that route. But I'm hoping it'll be the other way around, where we're looking at this from a respect perspective, you know, to say that, of course, I'm not going to mess with my customers' data. You know, we need to be very careful. And I think that there's actually, I'm saying this a lot here, I think that for those companies that take that type of approach, I think there's a competitive edge to be had over many years here, because most companies, unfortunately, do not take security or does not invest enough in security, nor do they necessarily take the laws, the data laws, seriously enough.
Got it. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to close the, let's say, official part soon. I'm going to turn the recording off, and I'm going to move to the more informal part, because I see I think there's no point of doing breakout rooms today. But I think we would benefit from an informal chat as well before the end of this event. I'd like to end it right, you know, at the time rather than extending it. So I just have 2 last questions. Johan, what do you think about the trends in privacy respecting cloud services? Do you think that companies are, let's say, having greater and greater awareness of, you know, the importance of owning their data, or do you think that the problem is getting worse? What are your thoughts on this?
I think the trend will be that we realize the value of data, right? I mean, in Europe, there's this huge dialogue. Some people are just like, let's all just use, you know, Amazon and the world will be great again, you know. But I think that the dialogue that I'm seeing, and frankly, to be blunt here, if you would have asked me 3 years ago that the same question, I would have said that with the lobbying machines that we have, there's going to be 2 or 3 companies simply taking over the world, right? And that's kind of where we are today. But I think that the things that we're seeing now, laws, values, and also now the resilience, right? The vulnerabilities that we see in society, I think they're so great that a lot of governments are starting to look at, we probably need to make changes in how we work. You know, take that long, tough route to actually make changes. I mean, I'm 50 years old, right? I barely like to change my phone out because it's a pain in the butt, right? Imagine a whole country starting to change out, let's say, Word or whatever it might be that you've used your whole life because you want to create more resilience. So I would say that the trend is that we'll learn that the data is even more valuable than we even thought, you know, the black that we call it now, right? And I think with that comes a respect where we're going to look at the laws as something much more serious going forward.